Okay, so we are in our last week of new content. After this week, it's just going to be review and the midterm, and then Thanksgiving in the middle there. Excuse me. What we're going to be doing, we're going to be closing things out basically by talking about the labor market, which is something that I've always done. It was not new this year, but there are some interesting wrinkles this year because the labor market is super, super hot in a way that it has not been in a very long time. I've said for a long time, the thing that the United States labor market needs more than anything else is somebody to figure out how to make work that does not require a college degree more valuable. And it looks like we found out, and it was, increasing demand and reducing supply and the sort of standard sort of things that you do. And now people are getting paid a whole lot of money. Everyone's getting raises, lots of strikes, lots of people quitting, which is exactly what you'd expect as the value of labor increases. So we're going to talk about the market for labor. Which is the market, of course, for people's time and effort. What are you doing when you work at a job? You are giving your effort to that job, and you're being paid for your time and your effort. You're getting paid for what you do, as opposed to what you own, being the other main way that people get income. Right? So how do you get money? Well, either you own something that people have to pay you for, or you do something that people are paying you for your time and effort. It's really the main two ways of doing it. So why are we going to focus on labor? Why are we going to close out the whole class by sort of summing it up by talking about the labor market? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, labor is just a big old market. More than half of all income goes to labor. Most of us will be in the labor market for most of our lives, unless you go and start your own business, and that's the main way that you work. Especially, and even then, you can probably work in your own business. But for most of us, we will either be in the labor market our entire lives, or even if you're a business owner, probably employing people and being a consumer in the labor market for your lives. Most people make money because of what they do, not because of what they own, which has very important implications for distribution. Right? People earn very little. People who earn very little are very more likely to be getting their income from the labor market. If the labor market is not paying that much right now, if the price of labor is low, then you would expect a lot more inequality, and you'd expect inequality to drop as the price of labor goes up, which is what we're seeing right now. It will be interesting to see how that all plays out. The other reason I want to focus on the labor market is that it's just a real good application of pretty much everything we've done so far. Right? Thinking about the labor market requires us to bring together a lot of topics that we have already discussed. We're going to talk about labor. We're going to talk about supply and demand and elasticity. Of course, that's going to play in. We're talking about market here. We're talking about production, which we talked about, right? Competitive production, pricing power, game theory, asymmetric information. It's all going to play in. Quick note, just to remember, because this is easy to get switched. But in a labor market, labor supply, the supply side is people who are supplying their labor, that is the workers. If you are being hired, you are a producer of labor. If you are hiring somebody, then you are a consumer of labor. So labor demand is people who want to purchase the labor of other people. So this is easy to get switched up because we tend to think of supply as being like companies, right? But in this case, it's swap. It's individual people who are usually the suppliers and companies who are usually the consumers. So bring that all together. The market for labor is basically a market for human effort. Let's see how this market works. And conveniently, a lot of the things we already learned are just going to come back here. We're just going to apply them again. So it's sort of its own form of exam review a little bit. So we're going to start by talking about labor supply. Okay, so we're talking about the relationship between what wage you offer people and how much they are willing to work. So labor supply can be kind of a difficult idea to wrap our heads around. Because it does work a little bit differently than supply curves in other contexts. So what is labor supply? So labor supply is the amount of labor that people want to provide at a given wage. You offer people a certain wage and you say, how many people are willing to, how much are you willing to work at this wage? And people will tell you, and they will work a certain amount. So when we're thinking on a broad scale, right, we're thinking about an economy, there's sort of a distinction between people who want to work and people who are working. Right? We have the concept of unemployment. Labor supply is not the number of people who are employed. If you remember from before, when we were talking about supply and demand, I gave the example of being an Uber driver. I said, I don't drive an Uber, but if they raised the amount they paid to $300 an hour, I would drive it. Right? So even though I'm not currently an Uber driver, I would be in the supply curve for Uber. Right? So if we look at a supply curve in the labor market, we're going to do a couple things slightly different. One, we're going to relabel the axes. We're not going to call them P and Q anymore. We're going to call them L for how much labor is provided or purchased, and we're going to call it W for wage. Same idea, we still have price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis, we're just calling them wage and labor. Next, we can draw out our supply curve just as we did before. We're going to call it labor supply, LS. And you can guess what labor demand is going to be called, LD. Okay, so, when we're looking at this, we have a wage, and we can say, okay, well, given what the wage is, let's pick a number, let's say it's, I don't know, 30 bucks an hour. Follow that along, this labor supply curve will tell us how many people are going to want to work and how much they're going to want to work at this given wage. So far we're doing the exact same stuff that we were doing with supply and demand, we just relabeled a couple things. That's really the only difference, and that's going to continue to be the case. We're going to keep doing things that we've seen similar before, we're going to relabel some stuff. The next thing we're going to relabel is our concept of a shortage or a surplus. So remember, we said the price is away from the equilibrium, then we're going to end up with an excess supply or an excess demand. Okay. Same thing's going to happen here, but we're going to relabel the idea. So let's think about what this labor supply is. So this is the number of people who want to provide their labor at the current wage. Right? This is going to be called our labor force. So you offer a certain wage, you see how many people want to work. So those are going to be the people who are in our labor force. Some people are not in the labor force. Some people do not want to work at the current wage. Right? Retirees do not want to work at the current wage. Children generally are not going to work in the market at the current wage. People who decide to be homemakers, they've decided they don't want to work at whatever the current wage is. Now it could be that these people are still on the labor supply curve. If you started offering 400 bucks an hour, some people who are currently homemakers would probably choose to go back to work. Or some retirees would choose to go back to work. Or some parents would be like, oh, 400 bucks an hour, let me send my kids out, right? These people are, so anybody who is not willing to work at the current wage, right, they're up here. These people are out of the labor force. They don't want to work at the current wage. Now, I have not used the word unemployment yet. These people are not unemployed, right? They don't want to work. It's not that they can't find a job, it's that they don't want a job at the current wages that are being offered. Maybe they would want a job if the wages went up, but if they haven't gone up, so it doesn't happen. Let's talk about what unemployment means. Unemployed people are people who want to work. They're in the labor market, but they do not have a job. So we're not going to jump all the way to putting labor demand on here yet, but let's say for whatever reason that the actual quantity of labor that we end up with is down here. Here's the actual labor we end up with. These people, these are going to be unemployed. People who want to work at the current wage, and yet they're not working. We got sort of three categories here. People who don't want to work at the current wage, people who want to work at the current wage, and people who are employed. And this distinction can actually explain some interesting things that we've seen happening over the past year or so, right? Where you can see like the economy starts recovering and the unemployment rate goes up. And that's kind of weird. Well, what's happening there is that as the economy recovers and wages go up, people enter the labor force, right? As the wage rises, wage goes up. More of these people are like, you know what? The wages are looking good now. Things are looking better. I want to go get a job. And for the period of time where they have entered the labor force, they are now looking for a job, but they haven't found one yet. They are unemployed. They've gone from being out of the labor force to being unemployed, which makes the unemployment rate go up. So when wages are rising, when the economy is sort of on the mend, you tend to see the unemployment rate going up, but for a good reason. Because people who maybe were not in the labor force have entered it as the wages has risen, and they found a reason to go back. They just haven't gotten there yet. So put things back out again. So let's put in labor demand now. I labeled these the old way, but this is the exact same graph that we had from from supply and demand, right? If here is the actual quantity that we end up with for some reason, we have people who are not in the labor force, they're not willing to work at the current wage, or we have a too high wage right here. People are not in the labor force, the wage is not high enough to get them to want to work. Down here, we have the people who are actually employed and people who are willing to hire at that high wage. And between those two, we have the unemployed people who want to work because of how high the wage is, but they cannot find a job, right? This is the same thing as excess supply that we had before, right? We have the quantity demanded over here, how much people want to hire at this wage. We have the quantity supplied over here, how much people want to work at this wage. And the difference between them is the people who want to work but cannot find a job. That is the unemployment rate.